So these are all closed circuits. In space, we have the International Space Station, mine rescue workers, submarines, diver, and closed circuit anesthesia machines. And what's common to all these situations is that CO2 will accumulate within these enclosed spaces. Unless we use what they call CO2 scrubbers, we call it CO2 absorbers. So that's the operating room I'm working. That's my data processing center. Here's the patient. Here I'm checking canisters. So, to get started, a reminder, 1% of CO2 means 1% of 760 millimeters of mercury, which is 7.6 millimeters of mercury, ignoring the water vapor pressure. What's the world's most famous CO2 absorber? This one. That's the one from Apollo 13, exactly. So this is a true story. When the Apollo 13 left, and a movie has been made out of it with Tom Hanks, there was an explosion of an oxygen fuel cell after 2 days. And so by that time they knew they couldn't make it to the moon. But one of the first issues they faced was a rise in partial pressure. And it went up to 50 millimeters of mercury. Now they had a lot of canisters on board, but some of them were sitting in the front, some were sitting in the back. And the problem was that the connection of the canisters was different. So they had two types of canisters there. And in order to get the CO2 down, they had to make a connection between something round and something square, using all the stuff that was on board of the Apollo 13. So in Houston, they took together all the stuff that was on board on the Apollo 13 and they actually fixed it. They made a connection that was life-saving to the astronauts. It's a great movie. What's the goal of this lecture? How high would the FiCO2 rise if there was no absorbent? When do I replace the canister? How to make sense out of all these canisters that are out there? And let's have a look at canister life. How high would the FiCO2 rise if there was no absorbent? What's the problem? Obviously, the lower the fresh gas flow, the more rebreathing there is in the circle breathing system, the more CO2 you will exhale, so the CO2 will rise. Where does the CO2 come from? Well, there's basically two sources, endogenous and exogenous, produced by the body and applied, for example, by the surgeon for a pneumoperitoneum. What's the CO2 production during general anesthesia? I did a literature research, and some of the best data actually came from Philip Payton. So this is the year of publication, and CO2 during anesthesia these are data from none, these are from Philip, and I think 140 milliliters per minute is about what CO2 production is. There's a wide range from 90 milliliters per minute to higher numbers in adults. If you apply a CO2 pneumoperitoneum, it will increase by another 30%. So you'll be inhaling 30% more CO2. So another question. How high would the FiCO2 rise if there was no absorbent, or if the absorbent was exhausted? Well, that depends on the fresh gas flow and the CO2 production by the patient. We have to have a look at our circle breathing system. Here is the rotameter and the vaporizer. Fresh gas flow goes from here into the inspiratory limb. And here we have a bag, or the lungs of the patient, and that's the CO2 production. At 160 milliliters per minute is what I took during most of my experiments. And then the gas is exhaled, and this is the ventilator, ventilating at 5,000 milliliters per minute. We're using an empty canister or no canister. Now, this basically is a mixer, and let's say we're using a fresh gas flow of 320 milliliters per minute. Then obviously you will have a lot of rebreathing. What will the FiCO2 be? Well, the total fresh gas flow here, if you add those two up, is 480 milliliters per minute, of which 160 is CO2, so about 1/3 is CO2. So you will end up with 33% of 760 milliliters of mercury, which is problematic. That's a lot of CO2. What if we use a fresh gas flow of 3,000 milliliters per minute, well, you will have less rebreathing. The part of the exhaled mixture will be disappearing through the exhaust valve. The total fresh gas flow is 3,160, out of which 160 is CO2. So about 120 is CO2, which is 38 millimeters of mercury. You have to add that to the arterial PCO2. You get a CO2 of around 70 in the arterial blood, which is compatible with life. What if I use a fresh gas flow above minute ventilation? When? Well, then there will be no rebreathing, obviously, and the FIC CO2 will be 0, so you might as well fill up your canister with popcorn, and it will get you the nice smell to the patient too. And actually, I remember reading this in an abstract long time ago. Somebody did it. So here I did a little in vitro test. I took an ACES anesthesia machine. I ventilated the 2-liter bag, and I had 160 milliliters of CO2 flowing into the tip of the balloon. And then I just lowered the fresh gas flow progressively. And this is the actual FiCO2 you get in the breathing system. And you see with a half-liter fresh gas flow, you get 150 millimeters of mercury if you do not use a canister. So clearly, we need canisters. Now the next question is, when do I replace the canister? And what maximum FiCO2 is acceptable? Well, it's not the FiCO2 that's important, not the inspired CO2, it's the end-tidal CO2, because that is what matters to our patient, because that determines the arterial CO2. So the FiCO2 will rise as the canister exhausts, but the FaCO2 will rise along, and that's the important number. So the question then becomes, what's the effect of the FiCO2 on the FaCO2? What's the effect of the inspired CO2 on the exhaled CO2? Well, the effect is simply additive. You just have to add it. I mean, it's a little oversimplification, but it comes close. And why is that? Well, this is just the alveolar air equation. We've seen it in physiology a long time ago, but basically what it says is that the end-tidal CO2 is just the sum of the FiCO2 plus this partial pressure, which depends on CO2 production. The higher CO2 production, the higher this will be. Ventilation, the more ventilation there will be, then this will drop. Somewhat arbitrarily, an FiCO2 of 0.5% denotes exhaustion of the canister. But again, what really matters is end-tidal CO2. So there are other factors that may trigger you to replace the canister when you're giving an anesthetic. Some departments say, hey, I want to change the canister every Monday because I want to make sure it's not dry. Other people look at color changes, which are an indication of CO2 absorption capacity, of humidity, and some don't have any color indicator, but I think it makes sense to use a 0.5% CO2 threshold. Okay, now let's try to classify the absorbers that are out there. Not all of them, but I'm going to focus on the pre-caps. These are the small pre-filled canisters, and they have advantages for automated low-flow anesthesia machines because they're small, so they allow rapid washing. They're easily handled without having to open the circuit, and according to Dorsch and Dorsch, a more frequent change might ensure a higher humidity and maybe less byproducts. I'm only going to discuss the canisters that fit to the ACES and the ZEIS, because at this time these are the two target-controlled low-flow anesthesia machines available. We've got an ESA grant, a Maquet ESA grant, and we will study canister use and agent use with the flow eye in the upcoming year. Okay, now how to make sense out of these canisters? Well, this is the way I approach it. I'm organizing them horizontally according to their chemical position and vertically according to the manufacturer. Have you gotten the paper I asked to distribute? I mean, I just gave it to you to make it easier to follow. There's a white sheet with all the canisters on there. Okay, let's start with the chemical composition. CO2 interacts with water to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then combines with calcium hydroxide, and basically all canisters but one use this process. There is one, the Eclipse from Micropore, that uses lithium hydroxide. The CO2 is incorporated, and you get calcium carbonate and lithium carbonate, and heat and water are released, which is nice because it helps preserve heat and humidity. To facilitate the reaction, potassium hydroxide and sodium hydroxide are added, or have been added. The problem is these additions cause anesthetic breakdown. Desflurane is decomposed into carbon monoxide, which binds hemoglobin. Sevoflurane becomes decomposed into compound A, which in rats causes real injury. We can have an entire lecture on this, but I would like to summarize it according to the Miller. In general, carbon monoxide has little significance as long as simple guidelines are observed. That is, don't leave your fresh gas flow too high so it doesn't dry out. And compound A is of theoretical and academic concern, but it's of theoretical concern and academic interest. But to date, no significant clinical related toxicity has been reported. But compound A does become an issue when the canister is dry. So turn your fresh gas, but with certain products, we'll get to that. Turn off your fresh gas flow Friday evening, because if you leave your fresh gas flow on Friday evening, depending a bit on the anesthesia machine you're using, you can dry the CO2 absorbent you're using, and it can generate, or some of them, we'll see in a moment, can generate carbon monoxide. Again, this breakdown to compound A is clinically important in certain countries like the USA, because regardless of this, the FDA says less than 150 ppm, that's what we want to have, so we use at least 1 liter per minute. In other countries, we don't have any restrictions, but if you think about CO2 absorbance, these regional differences have to be taken into account. The main culprit is potassium hydroxide. So we've gotten rid of the potassium hydroxide in all the canisters. Modern absorbers contain no potassium hydroxide. What about the sodium hydroxide? Well, there still is some compound A and carbon monoxide formation. Modern absorbers that use calcium hydroxide contain either some, and this is my arbitrary definition, so you're welcome to argue with this, but some, 2.5% weight percentage, a little or no sodium hydroxide. If there's no sodium hydroxide, the issue of compound A and carbon monoxide become moot. With lithium hydroxide, these are just non-issues. So it makes perfect sense to organize the canisters according to the chemical reaction. So what do we end up with? We have the calcium hydroxide canisters and the lithium hydroxide canister with either the calcium hydroxide with some or no sodium hydroxide, either more than 2.5. You have the Draeger soap, the Medisorb. And I'm only showing you the ones we studied. The Draeger soap free, the Medisorb EF, the Spherosorb, the low flow sorb, the M-sorb, so no sodium hydroxide, a little, some. And then finally, the Eclipse, which contains lithium hydroxide. All these above the line can generate some compound A and some CO. All these carbon monoxide underneath the line, they do not. It makes sense to organize them vertically according to the manufacturer, just to make it easy on ourselves. So this is a Draeger, GE, Intersurgical, Armstrong Medical, and Micropore. So these are the canisters we'll be talking about. Another thing that's important, the calcium carbonate, basically, I mean, what happens to the granules? They turn into garden lime. It's what you put on the flowers. That's what it becomes. Recycling this is not cost efficient. Lithium carbonate is different. Recycling it is cost efficient. It gets incorporated into, for example, lithium-ion batteries. Okay, now canister life. How long do they last? It's amazing how little data that's out there. No study compares many products. Many of them use absorbers out of the circuit. if you read Doors and Doors or the other major textbooks, there's just very little information out there. So we have been testing canisters over the last 2-3 years, and we used an in vitro setup which mimics in vitro conditions. We've been reporting the results at the last 2 ASA meetings. We will be reporting some more data 2 weeks from now in San Francisco. So what's our setup here? Well, we have our anesthesia machine, have a CO2 flow meter, and CO2 is flowing into the tip of the balloon at a rate of 160 milliliters per minute. Obviously, this is the lung, simulating the lungs, the bag, 2 liters. Ventilation, 5 liters per minute. And then I'm going to test the canisters. And for each fresh gas flow, I will use a new canister. And we tested the canisters across a wide fresh gas flow range using oxygen air. And the anesthesia machine we used for most canisters was the ACEs. Now, this is very important. Different anesthesia machines have different rebreathing characteristics. In the ACEs, the fresh gas flow is proximal to the inspiratory valve. In the ADU, it's distal to the inspiratory valve. And Zeus here is a different animal altogether. It has a blower which rapidly circulates the contents within the breathing system. And this tends to cool the absorber. And this is an effect on performers. So the actual organization of the different components within the circle breathing system do have an important effect. So if you compare canisters, make sure they've been tested with similar machines. Meaningful comparison requires same machine for all canisters. So what we did was we used the ACEs for all of them, except for this one, of course. This one is used with the ZS. So you cannot directly compare the results later on of this with the other products because they were tested with a different anesthesia machine. Now, what's the canister life when we use closed circuits? And I define this as 0.2 liters per minute. I will focus on the 0.2 here. In my second lecture, I will give you the performance over the entire fresh gas flow range. We're using a fresh gas flow of 0.2 liters per minute, so closed circuit. This is time, and this is the inspired CO2. So the canister goes along, suddenly it starts to exhaust. And let's say, once I see just a tiny little bit of CO2, 0.1%, which is the limit of what's reported on the screen, on the monitor, I'm going to replace it. Well, then the canister lasts 8 hours. But now let's say I'm going to wait until the FiCO2 rises to 0.5%. Then the canister will last, for example, 10 hours. So clinically, I translate this into, I'm going to replace it once the effect on the end-tidal CO2 starts to kick in. So here's the canister life for the different canisters with an FiCO2 of 0.1%. You can see there is a difference. The less sodium they contain, the shorter the canister life. These are all the calcium hydroxide canisters. This is the lithium hydroxide canisters. And you can see this one is actually the longest lasting. But of course, I said I'm going to wait until I have 0.5%. Then the numbers change. The overall pattern is similar. It's longer here, shorter here, but there are some noticeable or a few interesting things to note. First this. So how many hours do I actually gain by waiting, by accepting 0.5%? These are the numbers. And that's the relative gain in percentage. So really with the MSORP, for example, and those two, the low flow SORP and the sphere SORP, it's really worth waiting because you get a lot of canister life. Something else that's interesting to note, for example, here the low flow SORP compared with the MSORP Plus, 8 hours if my threshold is 0.1%, 6.5 hours, but if I wait up to 0.5%, they're no different. Why is that? Well, in order to understand, we have to go and have a look at the pattern once the canister starts to exhaust. So this one is the low flow SORP, the MSORP. If I replace the canister when I get 0.1%, the MSORP is shorter acting or has a shorter canister life than the low flow SORP. But if I accept 0.5, they become similar with regard to canister life. Now the amount of grams of, or the amount or grams of product within each absorber is different. Now, it doesn't matter to me as a clinician because I use a canister and I don't care how much is in there. But still, it's interesting to have a look at how long 100 grams of each product lasts. And these are the numbers you get. Again, it's a similar pattern. If it contains sodium hydroxide, the more sodium hydroxide, the longer lasting. The longer lasting. And this one here is the outlier, the lithium hydroxide, which lasts 185. That's minutes per 100 grams of product. There is variability between the canisters, and this is actually something between products, or the variability in canisters differs between products. This is actually something I don't have any. I can show some preliminary data, but I'm not going to make any statements on this. This is something we will be studying over the next year or so. And I'm just giving an example. It doesn't matter, just because I have nice graphs of these two absorbers. So this is time. This is the FiCO2. This is the fresh gas flow, 350 milliliters fresh gas flow. And you can see these are 4 canisters of the same lot, 5 canisters or 6 canisters of the same lot of the spherosorb and the Eclipse. And you can see that the variability differs, but I'm not going to make any statements on this because this really is preliminary data. You do see some difference in variability here with the Eclipse, and I'm just wondering whether this does not have to do with the fact that here you're using granules. You see, the calcium hydroxide absorbers use granules, so they're more prone to channeling. And what's channeling, you get little channels through which the CO2 finds its way, and then obviously the FiCO2 will rise, and your canister life will become shorter. Now the lithium hydroxide, the Eclipse is kind of interesting in the sense that it has preformed channels. It's like a piece of paper that's wrapped, and there's preformed channels. So there is already channeling. It's right there. So it's too early for me to tell, but I presume that's the cause for less variability, if confirmed in further studies. So I want to end with these take-home messages. How high would the CO2 rise if there was no absorbent? It depends on the CO2 production and the fresh gas flow. It becomes problematic if the fresh gas flow is too low. I replace the canister when I get 0.5%. You can classify the absorbers according to the chemical composition, calcium hydroxide or lithium hydroxide, and then within the calcium hydroxide absorbers, you have to look at the sodium hydroxide content. Canister life depends on the FiCO2 threshold you use, CO2 production, ventilation, the type of anesthesia machine you're using. And I think I mentioned that here. Canister life depends on the chemical composition, and for the calcium hydroxide canisters, whether or not there's any sodium hydroxide present. Thank you.